So, without further ado, good evening, everybody, and welcome to a really special evening. Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland. It's a book launch and it's coming live from Dublin. A quick overview of what we're going to be doing this evening. A quick introduction to ourselves, MX Publishing. We're going to talk a little bit about Mrs. Hudson Investigates, Susan's first book, her first collection, and then we'll go straight on to Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland and have a quick reading from Susan, and then we'll go into an author Q&A. During the evening, feel free to post things into the chat window and we'll come back to them. And also, if you have a question, if you go to the Q&A window, you can type one in there for Susan for later. So a little bit about us. MX Publishing was founded in 2006, so we're just 14 years old. We're the largest Sherlock Holmes publisher in the world. If you measure by the number of authors, you measure by the number of titles, or you measure by the number of books sold. So we've got about 120 authors writing for us around the world, literally spread out everywhere, the US, Canada, Australia, all over Europe. We have about 450 titles now, something like that. So we add about 50 new books every year. And we've sold about 2 million books overall. Print, ebooks, audiobooks are very, very popular now. And we've even branched into art with a wonderful project called The Art of Sherlock Holmes, with 56 brand new pieces of art that have been created from some of our stories. And we've started to do some collectibles and things like that as well. It's founded by myself, Steve Emmett, and my wife, Sharon. And we have two amazing editors who work with us, Richard T. Ryan and David Markham, both of whom are published many times, authors themselves as well. We are a social enterprise, so we actually have no salaried staff. We actually support 3 key causes. So pretty much everybody in the business has a day job, and we work on MX in the evenings and the weekends. We have 3 key causes that we look after. Stepping Stone School in the UK, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, Happy Life Children's Home in Kenya, and the United Nations World Food Programme, for whom I'm a mentor for the last 3 or 4 years. So we've also been doing some live performances during the COVID lockdown. So we've done 2 theatre performances so far. They're both on our website if you want to watch them. An Evening with Sherlock Holmes and A Scandal in Nova Alba. We will be having another theatre performance coming up in February, which is The Baron of Wimbledon. All the performances are free. Attendees can donate to our charities as well. And we've raised quite a lot of money for the key charities through those theatre performances. A little bit about Stepping Stone School. Many of you will know Stepping Stones if you're a big fan of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, because this is his former home, Undershore, which was bought by the school and converted into a state-of-the-art facility for children with learning disabilities. We've been partnered with them since 2009, and I've become a patron of the school since 2016. We do lots of events and we raise quite a lot of awareness for the school. We've got a series of books called the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, which Susan has written for and featured in. And that collection is now 24 volumes strong. It's about 500 stories in there now. And we've been running that collection since 2017. And we've raised about $75,000 now for the school through that collection. Close to our hearts is our second cause, which is Happy Life Children's Home in Kenya. You can see my wonderful wife Sharon there in the picture. It's a baby rescue project in Nairobi, and we've been working with them since 2012. We're both mentors for the project, and we do events awareness, and we spend Christmas and New Year there. This is the first year in 8 years that we won't actually be in Kenya due to COVID, but we have regular Zoom calls with the team there and talk to the kids on a regular basis. So on to the subject of the evening, Mrs. Hudson Investigates. So this is a picture, wonderful picture from the live launch of Mrs. Hudson Investigates in Dublin, and that's Susan there, second from the left, with Mrs. Hudson, Holmes and Watson, who did a live performance on the evening. A quick quote from the Sherlock Holmes Society of London: "And a triumph it is too. A book contains 7 tales, all told with great clarity and affection." And we'll come on to the key characters in the book shortly. And this is the book of the evening, launched a few days ago. Is Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland, the first feature-length story featuring Mrs. Hudson. And here's a wonderful quote from Barry Brown, who's a multi Mrs. Hudson writer in his own right. "In this extraordinarily researched book, Miss Knight manages to combine an engaging mystery with an entertaining introduction to life in Victorian England." So that's a wonderful quote from Barry there. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to a quick reading now from the book, and then we're going to go to an author Q&A. For everybody on the line, if you'd like to know more about Susan, you'd like to look at all of the books that she's authored and featured in, we've created a bit.ly link, a short link there. So you can go to bit.ly/Susan Knight, and you'll be able to see all of the books there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come off screen sharing now so that we can go into the reading. And here we are. Hi, Susan.
Hi. Well, you said a quick reading. Is 15 minutes too long? Because I can cut it shorter.
I think 15 minutes is fine. That will give everybody a chance to fire some questions in through the Q&A as well.
Great. Okay, well, I'm going to start from the beginning of the book, and then I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 4 as well. So just the beginning, because it'll set the scene for you all. So, if I could have foreseen what was awaiting me across the Irish Sea, I'm not sure I should ever have agreed to set out. However, hindsight, as they say, is a wonderful thing, and Kitty Melrose was in such a state, I felt it would be unchristian of me not to support her as much as I was able. I had no particular duties in Baker Street at that time, the events I'm about to narrate having taken place during the sad period when we all believed that Mr. H had fallen to his death at the Reichenbach Falls. To tell the truth, I was finding myself somewhat at a loose end and was rather down in spirits, so that when my neighbour, Mrs. Melrose, flew in the door in great distress, I'm afraid I rather welcomed the distraction. I should perhaps start by telling my readers a little about my neighbour. Kitty Melrose, a widow woman of my own age, that is to say, fast approaching the half-century, was born Kathleen O'Kelly in Ireland in County Wexford. A neat little woman with the pinkish freckled complexion and curls still burnished with red, typical of her race. Her grey-green eyes peer rather, due to short-sightedness and a touch of vanity that makes her reluctant to wear the eyeglasses that would fix the problem. Despite her marriage to an Englishman, and despite having spent long years in London raising her family, she has retained her soft Irish brogue. In addition, she's of the Roman Catholic faith, and in past times liked often to inform me that if I did not renounce my Protestantism, I was bound straight to hell when I died. To which I would reply quite sharply that I was willing to take the risk, since I did not consider God to be so small-minded if one's motives were pure, and that, moreover, I should never dream of consigning her to the same fate, despite the many superstitions of her race, of her faith. I'm glad to say that as we became closer friends, our disputes on the subject became less frequent. However, even lately, I've sometimes caught her looking at me with sad eyes, as if envisaging my horrible destiny on the day of judgment. On this occasion, however, religion was not on her mind, except insofar as it concerned the holy state of matrimony. Once she'd done sobbing, and once Clara, my faithful maidservant, had brought up a tray of hot tea and some crisp cinnamon biscuits that I'd cooked up that morning, Kitty thrust a letter at me, adding that it would explain all. "It is from my goddaughter Lily. She is to be married." "Surely a cause for rejoicing," I remarked. "I fear not." Kitty nibbled a corner of her biscuit. "I suspect that she is being forced against her will." "In this day and age," I exclaimed, "surely we've passed from the dark ages by now. And yet," I considered what little I knew of Ireland, thought to be by many an uncivilized place beyond the pale, its denizens, as depicted by Mr. Punch, tending to the ape-like. Lily's mother, Nora, was my dearest friend, Kitty continued. We grew up on neighboring farms and attended the same school. She was married very young to a man who turned out, well, I never knew the details, for by then I was living here about to be married to dear Edward, her late husband. But William Cullen turned out a rough sort of person, and the 3 sons she bore him were patterned after their father. Only Lily, the youngest, inherited the gentle and yielding nature of my friend. Here Kitty collapsed into tears again. I fear her sweetness will be the undoing of the poor girl as it was of her mother. What happened to Nora? I asked. I cannot say for certain, only that her husband, when he had drink taken, was liable to raise his fists against her. He was not ashamed in front of me, and I witnessed as much on the few occasions I stayed with the family. How horrible for her and for you, I said. Yes, she went on, it was horrid indeed, and I have to say I was never made welcome by the menfolk in that family. On that last occasion, indeed, I could tell that she was sickly, and shortly after my return home, I received a terse note from William to say that she had passed away. Not a telegram, mind, but a letter which took several days to arrive. It seems she was already buried. In Ireland, Martha, the funeral takes place very soon after death, just 1 or 2 days later. Even so, I thought it brutal of him to say it so in so many words, no need to come over, as I otherwise might have hastened to do. She was deeply moved, and I reached out and took her hand. Since then, she said, I understand, sorry, I cut a bit here. I understand the poor girl has become a general dog's body for the men in the household, as was her mother before her. And now this. She took up the letter again, which I had lain on the table. I'm afraid, I said, that you will have to read it to me, since I cannot decipher Lily's script. Clearly, any schooling the girl had received had not included the fine art of calligraphy. Kitty held the letter quite a distance from her face. As usual, she was come without her eyeglasses. Dearest godmother, she read, I trust you and your family are well, as we are here. It will no doubt surprise you as much as myself to learn that I am to be married in 2 short weeks. It would greatly comfort me if you could attend in the place of my dear mamma. You know, Martha, Kitty said, breaking off her reading, I begged William to permit Lily to come and live with me after Nora died. I felt it was not a healthy atmosphere for a young girl to be alone with men who cared little for her. He did not even bother to reply. Not if you put it to him that way. I did not, of course. I told him that as one who has only sons, I would dearly love a daughter and should intend that Lily, as the offspring of my beloved friend, would fill that space in my heart. So will you go to the wedding? I asked. I have to. I have to stop it, I think. I stared at her. Stop it? Goodness gracious, Kitty, whatever do you mean? Just listen. She resumed her reading. My husband-to-be is Francis Kinsella. You may remember the Kinsellas who have land that adjoins ours. I remember that tribe only too well, Martha, and for no good reason. As for Francis, he's an absolute horror. In what way? I asked. A nasty, cruel boy, a bully who takes pleasure in inflicting pain on innocent creatures. Cockfighting, hair-coursing, bull-baiting, you name it, Francie will be at the centre of all. Surely that is against the laws of the land. Do the police not intervene? Kitty gave me a pitying look. The police, is it, Martha? Not at all. Don't those boyos enjoy the sport as much as anyone else, down the country anyway? Or at the very least, they turn a blind eye. She sighed. Anyway, that's not all regarding the bold Francie Kinsella. She hesitated. What is it? They say, no, I cannot utter the words. A flush spread over her countenance. Come, Kitty, I said, you must tell. It's too horrible, Martha. She lowered her voice to a whisper. I have heard it rumored that he is the spawn of his sister with his father. My shock must have shown on my face. Now do you begin to understand? Kitty asked. Not really. Why ever should this man be forced on Lily? How can her father agree to such a match? Greed, plain and simple. Listen on. My father will not have to provide a dowry for me, quite the contrary, for he will receive a fine parcel of land once the knot is tied. A knot, Martha, a noose more like. He's selling his daughter to a monster who already has blood on his hands. What are you saying, that this Francis is a murderer on top of everything else? Well, as to that, Kitty conceded, I've never heard his name associated with the death of any man, woman, or child. But if to torture and kill God's creatures makes a murderer, then yes, indeed. When he was a lad, my brother told me, Francie and his gang would set fire to cats for the fun of seeing them run off screeching. I doubt that he has changed. This is indeed dreadful news, I said. No wonder you're distraught. Poor little Lily. I intend to travel to Ireland tomorrow and to bring Lily back here. And she paused then and looked directly into my eyes. I want you to come with me. What? I cannot manage it by myself, Martha, and you have been in such situations before and know what to do. I had to protest. I have never, ever been in such a situation, Kitty. I can assure you of that. What I mean is, you have faced dangers and withstood them. She was no doubt referring back to certain adventures I had recounted to her. The case of the smiling man, for instance, or that of the demon within. These, however, bore little resemblance to the enterprise she was now suggesting. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm desperate. I will pay all your expenses. That, I said coolly enough, would not be an issue. I am not a wealthy woman, but I can certainly pay my own way. But tomorrow, I added, it is too soon. There is no time to be lost, Martha. It is now a little over a week until the wedding day, and it will take 2 full days to travel to Wexford. She lifted a locket from her breast and opened it to show me the face of a child. This is Lily. She's just 15. A pretty girl with long dark hair but a mournful face. I even thought I detected fear in her eyes, but perhaps that was simply the effect of hearing of her impending fate. Really, Kitty, I do not see how it would be possible for me at such short notice. What is there to keep you at home now that he, she lifted her eyes to the ceiling, indicating the upstairs room of Mr. H, is no more? Despite the somewhat heartless nature of this remark, I confess that Kitty's tale intrigued me greatly. In recent times, moreover, I had developed a fondness for travel, and Wexford, being as I understood it on the eastern coast of Ireland, was not so very far after all from the mainland of Great Britain. I felt myself tempted. How would a person get there? I asked. So I'm stopping there and then moving to chapter 4, where she has now arrived in Ireland. And the family she's staying with, who are relations of Kitty, are Roman Catholics. So they're very exercised that she won't be able to go to church with them on Sunday. So they've set up an arrangement with some neighbours called the Timmonses, who are Protestant, who have agreed to pick her up and take her to church. So this is it. The Timmonses proved to be an elderly couple, most respectable in appearance. The delight the lady expressed at meeting me was quite excessive, and certainly more than my poor person warranted. My own delight consisted in the discovery that their carriage was covered and upholstered so that the journey to church was comfortable enough, although they could have no control over the rough terrain and potholes. The previous carriage she'd been in was Peter Kelly's cart, so she's very pleased to have this. They even had a driver, Barney, who apparently, as Mrs. Timmins told me in hushed tones, was an absolute treasure, his worth consisting apparently in his being prepared unreservedly to take on any number of tasks relating to the Timmins household. I do not know what we should do without him, Mrs. Timmins whispered. She was a tiny person with white hair puffing out under her bonnet and the sharp, bright eyes of a bird. He's utterly devoted, bless him, and does everything for us. We're not able for much any more, do you see? And she smiled a little sadly. The Colonel has a bad leg. That individual was a rigidly upright gentleman with a sanguineous complexion, sporting a bristling grey moustache. The few remaining strands of steely hair on his scalp had been combed into strictly regimented lines. He had served, as he hastened to inform me, in the Crimean War, the gammy leg being the result of an old wound which troubled him more now as the years passed. I was reminded of Dr. Watson, though I could never remember, in his case, if the wound he had incurred in the Afghan campaign was in his leg or in his shoulder. The Colonel shook his head. It was a bad business, he said, very bad. I was not sure if he meant the wound or the war until he added, hell on earth, Mrs. Hudson, if you could imagine that, hell on earth. I replied that I could not imagine any such thing and was afraid I knew nothing more about that particular war other than Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. I asked if Colonel Timmins had been part of that doomed band, but he laughed a bitter laugh and shook his head. I am no cavalry man, madam, he said. I served my country in the infantry. The Colonel served his country well, Mrs. Hudson, Mrs. Timmins added. He was a hero. He has medals, don't you know? I duly expressed my admiration. The Battle of Inkerman was a bad business, the Colonel said, very bad. I was with the Durham Regiment, don't you know, and we were nearly wiped out. The siege of Sebastopol was even worse. In trenches, Mrs. Hudson, his wife added, pits in the ground. It must have been horrible. I'll never forget one terrible storm, he continued. I'm not a superstitious man, far from it, but that November the 13th was unlucky for us. The storm blew down our tents, scattered our supplies, and sank the transport ships in Balaclava harbour. By God, we were in a bad way then, but we hung on by the skin of our teeth. British spirit, Mrs. Hudson, British spirit, it can't be beaten. He gazed at me with penetrating pale blue eyes. No, indeed, I said. Later, you know, we got the new Enfield rifles, and it was easier to pick the Ruskies off with those. Goodness. I suppose shooting people is what you do in war, but still I did not quite like the relish with which the Colonel expressed himself. They explained how after the Colonel's discharge from the army, the couple had come to Ireland 20 or more years earlier. I have family connections here, do you see, said Mrs. Timmins. Not that we have much to do with those cousins of yours, thank goodness. The Colonel spoke with a sharp edge to his tone. No, we don't, she replied and smiled at me again. Well, sometimes we pay them a courtesy visit, you know. The Colonel snorted. It seemed Mrs. Timmins's relations were no favourites of his. I still keep busy, the Colonel went on. Idleness would not suit me, Mrs. Hudson, not at all. He looked at me accusingly, as if suspecting me of that same vice. I serve as resident magistrate and am master of the hunt during the season, which is sadly over until October. Otherwise, you might have been pleased to join us. I nodded politely, although I've never hunted nor yet mounted a horse, and would be perfectly pleased never to do so in the future. We also keep bees, the Colonel added. Bees? Ah, how interesting that must be. It is indeed. The beehive, don't you know, is quite the microcosm of society. We can learn a lot from bees. They are ruled by a queen, I believe, I said, adding somewhat archly, even though there is no king. Just so, said the Colonel, frowning. Just like England at the moment, Mrs. Timmins trilled. I nodded, thinking it was not the same at all. Oh, Mortimer, Mrs. Timmins continued, we must give Mrs. Hudson a pot of our honey. Indeed we must. I thanked them, adding that I was most partial to that confection and thought it must taste delicious here in view of all the lovely flowers that grace the hedgerows. Oh, yes, we encourage lilac, lavender and honeysuckle in our garden, she replied, and there are cornflowers in the fields. You have forgotten the snapdragons, Augusta, added the Colonel. Bees are very partial to snapdragons, Mrs. Hudson, don't you know? I replied that it was news to me and most fascinating to learn, the which seemed to satisfy him. In this fashion, we chatted amicably along the way, despite his somewhat abrupt manner. At a certain point, we passed a farm I took to be derelict by the broken-down nature of the house and the evident neglect in the yard where implements stood rusting. Had the occupants been evicted, I asked. Not at all, Colonel Timmins replied gruffly. That's the Kinsella place. As if on cue, a young man of extraordinary beauty came out of a barn and regarded us with an inscrutable expression as we passed. Francie, said Mrs. Timmins shortly. That is Francie, I exclaimed in surprise. Had Kitty not described him as a horror? I turned to try and see more of Lily's betrothed and caught a glimpse of him still staring after us as we turned a corner. It's a bad business, Colonel Timmins said, shaking his head, a bad business. Was he referring to the state of the farm or the impending marriage? I did not feel that it was my place to question him on the matter, and soon again we were talking of other things. So that's it.
Fantastic. That's absolutely wonderful. For those of you that have joined online during the performance, if you'd like to let us know which city you're from in the chat window and the country. And we're going to go now to a Q&A with Susan. So we've got some questions that have been submitted in by the audience. So and we've got a few that we've got through by email as well. So what we're going to do now is go to the Q&A. So let's open up here. Susan, how did you get started with the series of books?
How did I get started? Well, I suppose it's become quite a fashion to take a character that isn't the main character in a series and to put things from their point of view, and particularly for women now that women are sort of rearing up and expressing themselves more and asserting themselves. So I thought, Mrs. Hudson has a story. What could it be? Wouldn't it be fun if she did a bit of sleuthing on the side? Now, at the time, I thought I was being terribly original, and so I wrote the series of stories without reference to anything else much. I think I found out that Barry Cryer had written Mrs. Hudson's Diary or something like that, but that was all I knew about other writers. So anyway, so I wrote these 7 stories, and I tried to get a publisher earlier on, and there was a degree of interest, but nothing that went actually as far as publication. So then I contacted the wonderful Roger Johnson, is it, of the Sherlock Holmes Society, and he put me on to Steve, and then Steve took me up. So that was great. So it was a question of putting her in 7 different situations and taking her sort of feminine side, the sensibility that Sherlock Holmes would certainly not have, the ability to chat to people and to, sympathize with them, that she would have a special skill in doing that. And that's how I started with the first story, that she was helping a woman who was in great distress and giving her sympathy and a shoulder to cry on, and also solving the mystery at the same time. So that was that.
Great. Thanks for that question, George. The next question is from Phil. Susan's use of language in the Victorian Register is flawless. How do you get that done?
Well, flawless, I hope. I'm not sure, but I suppose because I grew up reading a lot of that fiction, and maybe I'm Victorian in my previous existence or something like that. But I find it comes very easily to me. If it works, that I can throw myself into the register. I suppose I read a lot. That would be a previous generation, but I read a lot of Jane Austen, of course, and a lot of Victorian fiction, and of course a lot of Sherlock Holmes as well. So I don't know. If it works, it works. I'm grateful. Thank you.
What attracted you to the character of Mrs. Hudson? You said you wanted to pick a female character.
Yeah. And well, I think I've more or less answered that one in a way, that that I love the Sherlock Holmes stories. Poor old Mrs. Hudson doesn't get much of a look in, so it seemed like the obvious thing to take her off on a few adventures of her own.
Next question's from Leo. Did you learn anything new about the history of Ireland while you were doing the research for the book?
Oh, certainly, loads. I mean, I particularly, I actually mention it in the credits at the end, the acknowledgements at the end. The wonderful book by Angela Burke, The Burning of Bridget Cleary, a true story, and it wasn't just the actual story that she writes about, which is a terrible tale of a wife who was accused by her husband and the neighbors of being a witch and taken by the fairies, and they burnt her to get the witchery out of her, thinking that she would be then restored. And this only happened about the same time, the late 19th century in Ireland. But Angela Burke's skill is in bringing all sorts of she recreates the world of the Clearys so well, the rural Tipperary, all the superstitions. So that was very enlightening for me. And I mean, I would have known it vaguely already, but to have it put and the way people dressed and what they ate and that sort of thing, which you have to do when you're trying to write a historical novel. You have to try and get all those details right, because otherwise people will probably come down on you like a ton of bricks. And I'm sure there'll probably a few anachronisms and things. I had to try and find out about how would actually travel physically from London to Ireland in the end of the 19th century, and things like that too. So it's interesting. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, lots of research to be done, certainly. a comment and a question from Susie in Sandy Cove. She says this reminds me of Murder, She Wrote. Are you working on a TV series?
Oh, I'd love them to make a TV series. Wouldn't that be great? But no offers so far, anyway.
Fantastic.
I thought Olivia Colman would make a wonderful Mrs. Hudson.
Oh, excellent. Slight deviation from the Mrs. Hudson. I love this question. I love it when you have people deducing while they're actually watching something, a performance. But Maria says, what about the paintings behind you? Tell us about the paintings.
The paintings, well, the whole room is full of paintings. The ones you can actually see, I don't think you can see that one very well because there's a reflection. This is a David Hockney print. This thing I've had for years and years and years, and it's an oil painting, rather quite crude in a way, but I'm very fond of it, the colors and everything. I must have got it back in the, I don't know, 70s, maybe 60s even, I don't know, but I've had it forever. And this one is by an Israeli artist. I don't know if you can see that at all. Maybe there you are. And I can't remember his name. It's quite a nice little one though. I like that.
Well, now talk about massive coincidences. We've just had posts in from somebody who's joined us from Malaysia, and also somebody who's joined us from Tel Aviv. So there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Maybe they can tell you who the artist is.
It's I'm pretty sure. No, I can't remember. I'd have to rack my brains and delve back into the past, because I've had that for many, many years as well.
Yeah. So Robert says, I'm sorry, he can't help. He may be from Tel Aviv. He doesn't know who the artist is. Fanula asks the question, what's next for Mrs. Hudson?
Oh, well, yeah. What's next for Mrs. Hudson? Well, Mrs. Hudson is off to Paris because her sister's son has decided he wants to be an artist. And her sister is terribly exercised about this and wants to make sure that he's all right and everything is well. So they're going to go over to join the Belle Epoque, the fin de siècle Paris, and hobnob with a few artists. I've only started it, but that was also going to require a lot of research too. But it's nice to.
Oh dear, you'll have to go to Paris. What a shame. To do the right thing.
Well, if lockdown ever ends, yes.
So Ed has a question. Is your Mrs. Hudson Scottish in your stories? And does she offer curry for breakfast like in the naval treaty?
Well, she does occasionally have kedgeree, I think, but which is a kind of curried rice and smoked haddock dish. But I haven't made her Scottish particularly. No, she's not Scottish. But in fact, strangely enough, her daughter is married to a Scotsman. And one of the stories in Mrs. Hudson Investigates is set in Edinburgh, which incidentally is where my daughter lives, nearly in Edinburgh, across the Firth of Forth in Fife. But I know Edinburgh quite well. So I set the story there, Arthur's Seat and all that.
Mm-hmm. And Mary has a question. Where do you get the ideas for the shorter stories and for the novel? Do you weave in some general life experience, or how do the ideas for the storyline?
No, well, yeah, I don't think I found I suffer a bit from insomnia, and I found it was a great way of overcoming it to lie in bed and try and think out the plots. Where I got the ideas from, well, there's all sorts of things can trigger them. Is there anything specific? Let me think. Not really. I mean, just the one about I tried to make them a little bit in the way of the Sherlock Holmes ones, like the first one, the smiling man. I thought that was quite Conan Doyle type thing with the ghastly mask and all that sort of thing. But then some of the others are not like that at all. There's the man who disappears on the train, for instance, and don't know. I just grasp a few ideas out of the air and see what happens.
And do you write? Do you write does the story just flow out for you, or do you structure them?
Well, I do try. What I tend to do is do a lot of thinking in advance. So I wouldn't sit down with a blank screen and just get going like that. But at the same time, the actual act of writing brings out enormous amounts of ideas, more than if you're planning. I couldn't sit down and plan a book or a story from start to finish, but I would certainly have an idea where it was going before I started to write. That said, it might change direction while I'm writing. In fact, in Mrs. Hudson Goes to Ireland, initially I had a completely different idea about who the murderer was going to be. And then one of my friends read some of it, and she said, "Oh, I think the murderer is going to be so and so." And I thought, "Oh no, that's right." So I rethought it, and then I think it turned out much better.
Fantastic. And Helen's got an interesting question. Does Mrs. H have a love interest in your books?
Ah, well, that would be telling. She might not have a love interest herself, but she might have engendered some emotions in the breast of another. I'll put it that way.
There we go. Do you have any particular favourites in the Sherlock Holmes canon?
Well, gosh, I suppose I'm the very first one I read. I remember now because I misremembered when you asked me that before, Steve. But it was The Speckled Band, which we had in an anthology of mystery stories at home when I was growing up. So that was the first one I read, and I've always had a bit of a soft spot for that. But I like the Christmas one, The Blue Carbuncle. I'm very fond of that too. And Hound of the Baskervilles. I mean, most of the Dancing Men, I don't know, the Red-Headed League. I mean, they're all pretty good, aren't they? So difficult to say one better than another. Yeah.
And do you have any favourites amongst the modern pastiche writers? Who do you like?
What, Sherlock Holmes pastiche or any pastiche?
We'll start with Holmes, but feel free to.
Well, I'm not sure if I can think of any others, but certainly I mean, apart from all the wonderful writers who write for the David Markham collections of new Sherlock Holmes short stories, which I can highly recommend. It's one I think I've got one of them here beside me. Here it is. Great big thick anthology, and only £28.99 for all that for Christmas. And they're untold cases. So that's very interesting, because what the writer's been asked to do for that is to take one of I don't know if you know this, everyone's very familiar with the Sherlock Holmes stories, but Dr. Watson often says, well, we didn't, I'm not going into that particular one now, or we were involved in such and such a story. But he doesn't actually write it up. So what David Markham has asked us to do is to write up some of those untold stories. So that's a very interesting thing to do. And he makes sure we all write within the canon. So there's no jokey things or send-ups or anything like that. It has to be strictly as Sherlock, as Conan Doyle might have written them. So that's good. But another one, I mean, I'm always terribly impressed with Anthony Horowitz, and he's done lots of different pastiches of different things. He's done Sherlock Holmes, but he's also done, I think he's done James Bond. He's done all sorts. I just wonder would the real Anthony Horowitz please stand up, because I have no idea what he would write if he wasn't writing a pastiche, but he's certainly very skillful at it.
And Ed has asked the question, Mrs. Hudson and Hudson from the Gloria Scott connected?
Hudson from what?
The Scott. So I think Ed will probably have to. Yeah, you may have to explain that one. For those that haven't posted up a question, we go for maybe one or two more questions. either in the chat window or the question window. I'm just going to scroll back through the chat just to let everybody know that we have fans from all over the US, all over the UK. We have Malaysia, we have Israel, loads from all over Ireland, lots and lots from all over Dublin as well. If anybody else has got a question, oh, here we go. Mrs. Hudson is quite remarkable and quite quietly bitchy. Is her personality based on a real person? This is a question from Mary.
Who gave that question? Well, she means my Mrs. Hudson is
Your
bitchy,
Mrs.
does she?
Hudson, yeah, quietly bitchy.
Yeah. Well, quietly bitchy. Well, no, I wouldn't say bitchy. She's a little bit sharp, you know. Maybe in the way she looks at things, you know, she doesn't suffer fools gladly. And yeah, is she based on anybody? Well, she's not based on me because I'm not a bit like that. I'm not a bit bitchy, so it can't be me. So I don't know.
So two very related questions. Basically, after the visit to Paris, are you going to take Mrs. Hudson back to Scotland or back to Ireland?
I won't take her back. I don't think I'll take her back to Ireland because she's so traumatized by the whole experience that I don't think she ever wants to go back there. But I was thinking I might take her to Scotland. I thought that would be quite a nice place to go, if I can't think of anywhere further afield. But no, Scotland would be good. Yeah, but that's I have to write the French one first. So yeah.
As the publisher, it's all about setting deadlines. So Scotland next. Let's set that for 2022. How about that? Luke's got a great question. I like this one. What are the most enjoyable and conversely most difficult aspects of writing for a character like Mrs. Hudson? So what do you enjoy most and what's most difficult?
Well, because I like her, so I like putting her in situations where she can use her ingenuity to get out of the situation. So they are enjoyable to write. Actually, they're fun to write. I suppose the difficulty is just the hard slog of sitting down and churning out 1,500, 2,000 words a day. You know, some mornings you get up and you think, oh, I'm not sure if I want to do this, but I better, because keeping up the momentum is important. But no, but I do find them fun to write. I enjoy them. I've written other things which are not so much fun to write, which are more sort of devastating and tearing you apart type of things. So she's quite a relief, really, even though she gets into terrible situations sometimes.
I must admit, I thoroughly enjoy writing fiction, and I really struggle writing non-fiction. I find non-fiction hard in the sense that it's technically easier to do because it's a bit more structured with research, but I find it harder to make it engaging. Whereas with fiction, I guess your personality comes out in the writing, so you enjoy it as you do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Ed asks, is there going to be a Mr. Hudson at some point? Well,
poor Mr. Hudson is passed away. And she's very devoted to Mr. Hudson, Mr. Henry Hudson. And she often refers to him and misses him greatly, but she gets on with her life. I don't know if I don't think she feels inclined at the moment to find a replacement. Although in one of the stories, of course, in Mrs. Hudson Investigates, she does allow her head to be turned by a darling boy who happens to be Irish, because all Irishmen are so charming. And so she does get a bit silly about the darling boy in one of the stories, but then she pulls herself together and she realizes that won't do at all. So I don't know. Maybe you put an idea in my head now, so maybe I'll think about that. I don't know what Sherlock Holmes would think about Mrs. Hudson getting married, though. I don't think he'd approve, really, would he?
I'm not sure. As long as he got his breakfast on time, I think he'd be perfectly fine with it. I do love that turn of phrase, allowed her head to be turned. That's like sometimes when I speak to younger members of staff and refer to the word courting, and they look at you blankly Are they courting? Right, we seem to have come to the end of the questions. We're just going to give 30 seconds for anybody who's got a burning question there for Susan to post it into the chat or into the question window. And then we'll see, we'll have a little bit of wrap up. Okay, so no more questions. So it just remains for me to thank you so much, Susan, for giving us a wonderful reading, and really looking forward to getting Mrs. Hudson's adventure in Paris into my hands in the not too far distant future. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving day for all of the Americans that are online, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
And there was one little question that popped up on my screen from Susan Kennedy asking if it was based on any real events. And just to say quickly that very, very, very loosely on that Bridget Cleary thing, but it's not really based on that, but I was aware of the situation when I was writing it, but otherwise it's completely fiction. No real people should sue me on behalf of anybody mentioned in the story. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Susan, and we'll see everybody again soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve.